Roland Packman's perfect mansion betrayed him. 3 items vanished, then 6, then 9, and every trail pointed to the same person, his elderly maid of 30 years. So tonight, Roland didn't call security. He killed the cameras and followed her into the darkness. But the building she slipped into wasn't a pawn shop. So what in God's name was Anne Rochus hiding behind that locked factory door? And why did she buzz herself in with a secret pattern? If you're ready to enjoy the story, click subscribe, like the video, and tell me where you're watching from. Your support helps us to bring more interesting stories like this, and you don't want to miss it. The automated security gate whooshed open for the final time that evening. Roland watched from the shadows of his garage as Anne Rochus signed out at the staff entrance. His tailored suit was replaced by a dark, nondescript jacket, an uncomfortable disguise he hadn't worn since college. The absurdity of the situation, a real estate titan staking out his own maid, felt like a disruption to the precise algorithm of his life. Yet the inventory discrepancy had lodged too deep to ignore. He watched her walk down the long, sweeping driveway. She was wearing the same practical, worn coat he remembered from 2 winters prior. Its cuffs meticulously mended a detail he would never have registered a week ago. Her canvas bag was slung over one shoulder, heavy and shapeless. He suspected it held the proof of her guilt. He realized, with a small, cold jolt, that in the 30 years she had been a fixture in his home, he had never once considered where she went, who she was, or what her life contained once she passed the boundary of his property. She was an essential ghost. Roland slid behind the wheel of his low-slung performance coupe. He kept his distance, ensuring his familiar license plate remained safely out of her view. Anne didn't call a rideshare, nor did she head toward the commuter train station favored by most estate staff. Instead, she turned onto a cracked sidewalk and began to walk, methodically and with purpose, cutting through residential side streets. Roland had only ever charted on demographic heat maps. The journey quickly became an exercise in profound disorientation. Roland, accustomed to the silent, frictionless movement of his own sphere, was forced to navigate the chaotic arteries of the city. Anne boarded a public bus, an older model that groaned like a tired animal, forcing Roland to follow its lurching, unscheduled pace. With every block, his insulated world fractured further. Glass towers gave way to faded brick and peeling stucco. The soft, ambient light of his neighborhood was replaced by the harsh, unfiltered glare of yellow street lamps. Billboards that usually advertised his luxury properties here were defaced or replaced by handwritten offers for cash loans. He was driving through the city's unexamined foundation, the parts he built upon, but never visited. The air felt heavier, scented with exhaust and cooking oil, a visceral reality check that his climate-controlled bubble had protected him from. He recognized the area only vaguely, a transitional district, marked for future acquisition, but currently classified in his internal reports as a high-risk zone. Anne finally stepped off the bus near what looked like an abandoned industrial block. It was an old textile factory, repurposed haphazardly. Roland pulled into a deep shadow 2 blocks away and killed his engine. He watched as she approached the main street door. She didn't look around or hesitate. She reached up and rang the buzzer twice in a distinctive, rhythmic pattern, then pushed the heavy door inward. A spill of warm, inviting yellow light bled onto the street, quickly cut off as the door shut behind her. Roland sat motionless for a minute. He couldn't leave now. He needed to know what this place was. He stepped out of the car, the silence of the street amplifying the rustle of his jacket. He crossed the street, drawn by the faint light. He stopped at a cracked, dusty window offset from the entrance. Taped crookedly to the old brick beside the door was a worn, handwritten sign, barely legible in the darkness. Safe room. Ask for Miss Rochus. Roland's heart hammered against his ribs. He was crossing the threshold of his control, transforming from a surveillance operator into a trespasser. He leaned in, placing one hand flat on the cool, rough glass. He peered inside. If you're captivated by Roland's journey out of his golden cage, smash that like button and tell us in the comments what you think Anne is truly hiding. Roland pressed his eye against the cracked pane, and the cold, logical framework of his evening shattered instantly. The interior of the old textile factory had been scrubbed and organized, but it was still unmistakably raw. The high, exposed ceiling and scarred concrete floor spoke of industrial neglect, yet the space itself was pulsing with a quiet, powerful warmth. It was a makeshift classroom. Long, folding tables were arranged end to end, holding stacks of worn textbooks and dog-eared exercise books. In place of the sharp, modern art that hung in his mansion, the walls were covered in hand-drawn visual aids, multiplication tables scrawled in thick marker, and colorful posters illustrating basic sentence structure. The low, steady sound that reached him through the glass was not the hurried, transactional chatter of a service job, but the low, intense murmur of concentration. He scanned the room, and a surge of profound disorientation hit him. These weren't strangers. These were the invisible people of the city, the workers who silently kept the machinery of his empire running. At one table, a group of 5 women, all still wearing the neat, generic grey uniforms of various cleaning services, were hunched over their workbooks, their lips moving silently as they sounded out words. He recognized one of the uniforms, the specific collar pattern used by the crew that maintained the lobby of his flagship downtown tower. At another table sat 3 men in cheap, thick jackets, practicing penmanship. They were security guards, their postures suggesting hours spent standing immobile in lobbies or parking garages. Roland watched a 50-year-old man, whose name he might have signed off on once in a payroll spreadsheet, carefully guide a thick-knuckled hand across the page, struggling to etch his own name in a steady, straight line. In the back, children clustered around a table, their small faces illuminated by a flickering, cool light. Roland's stomach dropped as he recognized the light source, a stack of older model Pacman Corporation tablets, the exact models his system had flagged as missing from storage, due for device refresh and immediate disposal. Here, they were carefully labeled, each with a child's name taped to the back, treated with the solemnity of expensive treasures. And in the center of it all stood Anne Rochas. She wore a simple, soft blue dress, the grey, starched uniform discarded. The transformation was absolute. In the mansion, Anne was the essential ghost, subservient, quiet, moving only to serve. Here, she radiated an unhurried, magnetic authority. She held a marker in one hand and a dog-eared picture book in the other, moving between the tables with the effortless grace of a master conductor. There was no judgment in her stance, only steady, powerful patience. His gaze returned to the evidence. On a shelf near the entrance, the stolen goods were meticulously arranged. Cases of bottled water, now with handwritten dates showing their freshness, and stacks of exercise books with the faint, partially scratched-off Pacman logo visible beneath the ink. Most damningly, the box of high-end bed linens he had flagged as missing had been cut, sewn, and transformed into small, cheerful cushion covers, scattered across the children's reading corner. A girl with braids and sleepy eyes leaned against one, whispering the words on her page like they were secrets only the cushion could hear. Nothing here felt stolen. It felt rescued. Roland stood paralyzed by the slow, grinding humiliation of this realization. He had viewed this woman, this constant of his life, through the sterile lens of a discrepancy report, anticipating the base motivation of greed. Instead, he had walked into her second, more meaningful life, a life dedicated to elevating the very people his business model rendered disposable. The difference between Roland's world and Anne's was simple. Roland generated waste. Anne generated worth. He focused on a young boy struggling with a complex word in a reading circle. The boy's forehead was furrowed in frustration. Anne knelt beside him, bringing her eyes level with his. "Sound it out," she murmured, her voice steady and rich. "You already know the first part. Don't rush. The word isn't going anywhere." The boy tried again, his voice cracking with effort. Together, Anne repeated, her face lighting up with a proud, genuine smile. "Exactly. That's how we move. Together." The purity of that moment, the simple act of connection and shared triumph, broke the final seal on Roland's carefully constructed indifference. He finally noticed a faded, curling certificate taped to a far support column. He squinted through the dirty glass until he could make out the bold title. Annette Rochas, Community Literacy Facilitator, 1994. That was decades ago, before his divorce, before his father's death, before he even inherited the company. The weight of 30 years of unasked questions, of willful ignorance, crashed down on him. He had followed Anne Rochas to prove she was a common thief. What he found was that he had been blind to a community leader, a quiet force of dignity, running her life's work in the shadows of the empire he controlled. Roland took a stumbling step back, his throat tight with a shock that was far colder and more profound than the suspicion of theft. This wasn't just her secret he'd uncovered. It was his blind spot, exposed and glaring. And now that he had seen the foundation, he knew he couldn't pretend the towers stood alone. Roland didn't move. The image of the 1994 certificate, Annette Rochas, community literacy facilitator, was a timeline of his own willful ignorance. While he had been busy inheriting and expanding an empire, she had been quietly building a foundation of her own, one word at a time, entirely beneath his notice. Anne had moved from the reading circle to the center table, now addressing the cluster of older men and women who had come straight from their evening shifts. This lesson wasn't about grammar, it was about survival. "What is a principal?" Anne asked the group, tapping a worn overhead projector screen. "Is it the person who runs a school?" A woman in a housekeeper's uniform shook her head. "No, Miss Rochas. That is the one with the L-E on the end. This one is money." "Exactly," Anne affirmed. "It is the money you owe." "And the interest?" For the next 20 minutes, she dissected a simple bank loan application, translating the technical, often predatory jargon into plain, actionable language. She explained the true cost of compounding interest and the subtle, legal ways a debt structure designed by men like Roland Packman could keep them permanently locked in a cycle of service. Roland, the architect of the financial structures that dictated the city's commerce, was watching his own system disassembled and explained with brutal honesty. The tools of his world control and capital were being countered by the tools of hers, literacy and informed consent. Roland's hands trembled against the cool glass. His mind, the machine that processed risk and profit, automatically began cross-referencing. The missing linens were now cushion covers, providing dignity in a reading corner. The bottled water not sold for profit, but lined up neatly for basic hydration. The outdated tablets, marked for shredding, were now windows to the world for the children of his own staff. His flawless logic of theft collapsed under the weight of need. Anne hadn't taken anything of value. She had intercepted waste and converted it into purpose. The crime wasn't in the taking. The crime was in the system that deemed these items, and implicitly the people who needed them, disposable. His inventory system had marked them for disposal. Anne's morality had marked them for rescue. A sharp, painful moment of personalization drilled into Roland. Among the security guards practicing simple letter writing, he spotted a face he recognized instantly. Marcus, the quiet giant assigned to the lobby of the Packman Tower, East Roland's signature skyscraper. Marcus was a polite, uniformed figure Roland had seen hundreds of times but never looked at. Here, hunched over his work, Marcus looked utterly exhausted but fiercely focused, struggling to write a simple letter home that had to be perfect. This wasn't an abstract community. This was his community, the human infrastructure he took for granted every time he reviewed his perfectly balanced financial models. Anne stepped forward, resting a hand lightly on the edge of the central table, commanding the room without raising her voice. Her voice dropped slightly, carrying a deeper, more personal conviction. "Some things in the world are labeled waste," she said, her gaze sweeping over the Packman-branded supplies. "They tell you these things are broken, obsolete, unworthy of keeping. They tell you you are obsolete because you cannot read the fine print." She paused, looking at the cushion covers. "We don't steal," she stated, simply, the word hanging like a challenge. "We reclaim what the world leaves behind. This water, these tablets, these fabrics, they weren't stolen, they were saved. Because every person, every child, and yes, every discarded item has a story and a value worth fighting for. Our work here isn't about getting rich, it's about getting dignity." As the realization of her moral clarity washed over him, Roland felt a cold, deep sting of shame. He was the one who was morally and emotionally bankrupt. Suddenly, a brittle, high-pitched noise cut through the quiet hum of the lesson, the unmistakable, metallic vibration of a cell phone on a wooden table. Roland froze. Anne paused mid-sentence, her head turning slowly. Her gaze moved directly to the cracked window, past the dust, past the darkness, past the reflection of the street lamps. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, landed precisely where Roland was hiding. It was only a fraction of a second, an uncomfortable, electrifying moment of connection. She didn't react, no widening of the eyes, no gasp, but the stillness in her face was confirmation. She had seen him. She had known he was there all along. A surge of primal panic, cold and hard, hit him. He spun away from the window, stumbling back into the deep shadow of the alley, his heart pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm against the tailored fabric of his jacket. The silent pursuit was over. He was the one caught. Roland's secret is nearly exposed. Do you think he should walk away now and try to forget what he saw, or stay and risk full confrontation to learn more? Let us know the comment section. Roland didn't remember starting the car, or the drive back. The low-profile coupe glided through the city, but Roland was no longer the master of its controls. He was a machine on autopilot. The shame from that silent, piercing glance Anne had given the window was a physical weight in his chest, far heavier than any financial loss. She hadn't just caught him watching, she had caught him misjudging. She had seen the raw, ugly truth of his suspicion. He pulled into the sterile safety of his cliffside mansion. The house, usually a perfect expression of his control, now felt hollow, an empty fortress built on foundations he realized were morally compromised. The silent marble floors and glass walls, designed to offer clarity, now only amplified the deafening silence of his 30 years of willful ignorance. Ignoring the kitchen and the custom-built media room, Roland went straight to his private study. This was his sanctuary of data, the room where the world was reduced to verifiable facts and profit margins. He accessed the Pacman family archives, bypassing all standard HR protocols with his private override code. He needed facts to combat the emotional chaos. He needed to understand the true dimensions of the essential ghost who maintained his life. He pulled Anne Rochus's personnel file. It was ridiculously thin, a relic from the pre-digital era. Her start date was etched in faded black ink, 1989. A history of almost 3 decades of service, reduced to a dozen sheets of paper. He skimmed the records, noting the salary, consistently low, rising only by small, mandated percentages over the years. No bonuses of substance, no promotions, just steady, unexamined compliance. He realized she had been paid the bare minimum to ensure she stayed compliant and present. But the file itself was clean, spotless attendance, pristine performance reviews. There was nothing that pointed to greed, desperation, or even ambition, just service. He dug deeper, cross-referencing her name with internal historical memos from his father's era. Most of the files were irrelevant, but then a brief, forgotten folder from 1994 popped up the same year as the certificate he'd seen on the factory wall. The file detailed a short-lived, internal Pacman employee wellness project. It was a brief, dismissive memo about a volunteer literacy program that had been quietly proposed by staff. The document ended with a furious, handwritten note from his late father, calling the program a distraction from efficiency and ordering its immediate termination. Listed as the project's key organizer, the primary advocate who had fought for the program until it was shut down, Annette Rochus. The revelation was a punch to Roland's gut. The factory wasn't a sudden endeavor, it was her life's work, sidelined by the very family she served and kept alive in secret for decades. His family had not only ignored her true self, they had actively crushed her original initiative, forcing her vision into the shadows. A wave of bitter cold spread through him as he opened a sealed executor's note from his late mother's estate. His mother, always kind and observant, had left Anne a small, significant sum in her will, intended to help with her project. The accompanying memo, written by the former estate manager, a man Roland had appointed after his father's death, stated that the money was instead paid out as a staggered staff bonus over 10 years. The manager's reason, explicitly typed in the footer, to prevent the development of unauthorized external activities and ensure continued domestic focus. Roland sat back, the air knocked out of him. His own efficient, automated system hadn't just ignored her, it had been actively designed to subvert her purpose and keep her silent. The money that was supposed to fund her dignity center was filtered and neutralized, used instead as a tool of compliance. He realized his system, which he trusted implicitly, had perpetuated the silence and compounded the injustice. He pulled up the inventory logs on his dashboard. The tiny orange icon still blinked, marking the linens, tablets, and water as discrepancy. He closed his eyes, then opened them and typed rapidly, overriding the system's status. He didn't delete the entries. He changed the classification. The logs now read, Inventory transfer, donated, status, closed. As the system processed the change, a new alert flashed onto the screen, not an inventory issue, but a staff anomaly. Anne had submitted a formal request 2 hours ago. She was requesting 2 weeks of immediate unpaid leave, starting next week. The reason given, terse and clinical, personal obligation. Roland's breath hitched. Unpaid leave. Why? The center, the rent, the supplies. He immediately suspected this wasn't a vacation. This was a desperate move to raise money for her foundation. Her dedication, which his family had extinguished decades ago, was now costing her her livelihood. He couldn't shake the image of her tired face, her sharp, knowing eyes. She was mobilizing for a crisis, and she was doing it alone. He stared at the screen, the digitized request burning into his mind. The money and power that defined his entire existence felt utterly useless against the simple, profound commitment of the woman who cleaned his house. The sight of Anne's unpaid leave request burned itself into Roland's mind, cementing the cold reality. The center, her life's work, was in financial trouble, and her commitment was costing her everything. His first instinct was the only solution he ever truly trusted: capital. He summoned his estate manager, Davies, the next morning. Davies, a man whose sole purpose was to maintain the frictionless operation of Roland's wealth, listened to the order. Discreetly transfer a substantial, anonymous sum of cash, enough to cover the center's expenses for a year, to the community outreach fund associated with the district. The money was classified as a grant for obsolete inventory management. Davies was back on the secure line within the hour, sounding flustered, a rare and unsettling occurrence. Sir, the transfer is stalled. The recipient organization, a small non-profit, has flagged it. They require detailed donor information and a face-to-face meeting to determine intent. Override it, Roland ordered, his voice flat. I can't, sir. The contact person is firm. She says large, sudden, anonymous wires feel like a bribe, or worse, money meant to buy silence. She insists that any money accepted must come with full transparency. Her name, sir, is Annette Rojas. Roland hung up without a reply. His most potent weapon, the checkbook that bought silence and built empires, was utterly useless here. Anne didn't want his donation, she wanted his honesty. His attempted Roland solution failed because it lacked a foundation of trust. Later that afternoon, Anne was polishing the silver service in the dining hall, a meticulous, decades-old routine. Roland approached, attempting to penetrate the 30-year wall of professionalism she had built. Miss Rojas, he began, his voice unnaturally soft. About your leave request, unpaid. I could arrange a paid sabbatical, a generous one. You've earned it. Anne's movements didn't falter. The silver shone under her steady hand. That is kind, Mr. Packman, but I require the time, not the funds. My personal obligation cannot be fulfilled by a check. But surely, at your age, after so many years of service, she finally paused, holding up a gleaming fork, examining its flawless surface. Her eyes lifted to his. They were the polite, reserved eyes of the Packman maid, impenetrable and utterly non-committal. My obligations are my own, sir, and my service to the Packman family ends when I step past your gate. I assure you, my personal life is managed with the same efficiency you expect in this house. The veiled reprimand was clear. You know nothing of my efficiency outside these walls. Roland realized he was speaking to a beautifully constructed mask, a character perfected over 3 decades. He couldn't force the truth from her. His authority only reinforced the barrier. He retreated, knowing he had to stop trying to solve this with spreadsheets or subtle inquiries. He had to shed his armor and meet her on her own ground. That evening, Roland changed clothes for the 3rd time. He chose a simple, unbranded charcoal sweater and dark chinos, leaving his watch, his briefcase, and his personal cell phone locked away. He had to arrive as a man, not an institution. The drive was tense, a journey across the city's invisible cultural fault lines. He found his familiar shadow spot near the old factory. He didn't waste time on surveillance. He walked directly to the heavy door, lifted his hand, and rang the buzzer. 2 short rings, the pattern he had watched her use. The latch clicked, and the door opened slowly, stopping just short of full disclosure. Anne Rochas stood there. She was in the blue dress, the powerful, unguarded version of herself from the night school. Her face was calm, bearing the weight of a monumental expectation. She saw the man who owned the skyline standing on her broken concrete step, dressed in the vulnerable uniform of a civilian. She recognized the fear in his posture, the lack of his usual arrogance. She looked at him, at the billionaire who had followed her, who had researched her past, and who now stood before her without his usual shield. Before Roland could utter the clumsy introduction he had rehearsed, Anne delivered the final, crushing blow, her voice low, measured, and utterly devoid of surprise. "Mr. Packman," she said, "I was wondering when you'd stop watching." Anne knew all along. What will Roland say to explain his presence and his intentions? Subscribe now to find out if this confrontation will save him or sink his reputation. Anne's voice, the one stripped of its professional deference, was a low, measured thunder. "Mr. Packman, I was wondering when you'd stop watching." The certainty in her tone, the sheer lack of surprise, drained the last of Roland's defenses. The billionaire who usually commanded rooms and dictated terms was reduced to a nervous trespasser on a cracked doorstep. "Miss Rochas, I apologize," Roland stammered, his voice dry. Anne didn't move. She simply stepped back, opening the door wider to allow him entrance. "The students are on break. Come in, if you have something to say that can't be whispered through a dirty window." Roland stepped across the threshold, and the familiar scent of old paper, warm tea, and soap, the scent of honest work, not sterile cleaning, enveloped him. The room felt immense, pulsing with latent energy. She led him to a small, secluded office nook near the back, separated by a thin, folding screen. Anne folded her arms, her posture radiating a calm, unyielding authority Roland had only ever felt from his late father. The years of service at the mansion were instantly irrelevant. Here, he was the subordinate, and she was the judge. "You have been inside this house for decades," she said, her voice quiet but carrying immense weight. "You know where I work, what I wear, and what I earn. Yet you chose to follow me here. Tell me, honestly, why did you pursue me, Mr. Packman?" Roland dropped his shoulders, the charcoal sweater suddenly feeling heavy. He met her gaze, deciding on absolute honesty, the one currency his world rarely demanded. "I saw the inventory discrepancy," he admitted, the words tasting sour. "Linens, tablets, bottled water, items marked for disposal. I rejected the security team's report and came myself because I suspected theft. I suspected betrayal." He took a deep breath, the shame tightening his throat. "I was wrong. I was profoundly wrong. I watched you last night, Miss Rochas. I saw the tablets. I saw the cushion covers. I saw the water. I saw the children and the men from my own buildings. The items weren't stolen. They were reclaimed. I came tonight to tell you that I changed the logs. They are marked as officially donated." Anne didn't flinch. Her steady gaze remained fixed on him, demanding more than a simple apology. "You suspected theft?" she repeated slowly, the word hanging like an insult. "What did you think I was going to do? Sell old towels for profit? That's what your algorithm told you about the woman who helped raise you." She pushed off the desk and walked over to a stack of refurbished tablets, the old Packman corporate models. She held one up. "You see the items as a quantity on a ledger. I see them as tools." Her voice hardened with conviction. "I didn't steal, Mr. Packman. I only diverted what you had already marked for destruction. These tablets were going to be shredded, millions of dollars worth of technology, wiped clean and buried, simply because they were obsolete in your model. This was waste to you. To that boy, that is his first window to the world. It's how he learns basic accounting and gets a job outside of a cleaning crew." She gestured toward the entire room. "Which inventory is more honest? The one that deems people and things disposable, or the one that gives them a second chance at worth?" Roland had no answer. He stood utterly silenced by her moral clarity, the shame now curdling into a bitter realization of his own family's systemic cruelty. He swallowed hard. "I saw your leave request. Unpaid. I tried to transfer a grant, but your team flagged it. Why are you taking unpaid leave?" Anne's powerful composure cracked just slightly, a momentary flicker of fatigue and worry in her eyes. "The center needs funds, Mr. Packman. The lease is up for renewal, and we have a major repair issue with the heating system. The money for this center is hard-won, often $1 at a time from the people you saw out there. My salary from the Packman family is substantial, but every cent of that is needed for my own home and family." She lifted her chin, the act a defiant refusal to beg. "I requested the unpaid leave because I need the time to work a second, weekend cleaning job for a different family across town. That money, the wages earned entirely outside of your employment, will cover the repairs. My 1,994 dedication is now costing me my only reliable income. It's the price of not letting my community be bulldozed like obsolete machinery." The air was thick with the weight of her sacrifice. Roland stood motionless. The realization that he was a descendant of the very people who had deliberately stifled her dream and then monetarily suppressed her mother's aid was overwhelming. This was the true cost of service, decades of quiet, unacknowledged labor, culminating in her having to scrub floors on her day off just to keep her passion alive. Anne stepped close to him, her eyes tired but firm, the gaze of the woman who had guided him as a child and managed his home for decades. "You've always been good at building things, Mr. Packman. Towers, structures, systems. But you have no idea how to keep them, how to maintain the human foundation beneath the concrete. You only see what's on the floor above you. Now that you've seen the foundation, what are you going to do?" Roland stood before Anne, the vastness of his fortune suddenly feeling like a cage built of meaningless zeros. Anne's question, "Now that you've seen the foundation, what are you going to do?" was not a request for money, it was a demand for moral utility. He finally understood why his anonymous grant had been rejected. She didn't need a palliative band-aid. She needed a partner who would dismantle the system that created the injury in the first place. Roland straightened, the coldness of the factory air sharpening his focus. His face, usually a mask of detached calculation, was now resolute. "I won't write a check, Miss Rochas," he said, his voice firm, shedding the tentative tone he'd used earlier. "My money, as you rightly pointed out, has done more harm than good in your life. A check would be an extension of that silence." He gestured around the powerful makeshift classroom. "What this place needs isn't a donation, it needs capacity. The certainty that this foundation you've built won't be swallowed by a lease renewal or a heating bill. That is a problem I am uniquely equipped to solve." Roland looked directly at her. "I know this city's real estate code better than anyone. I know how to secure a building, not just for a year, but permanently outside the grasp of landlords and speculative development. I want to use my legal and financial apparatus to establish this factory, this entire operation, as a protected community trust under the Packman name. The same name that closed you down in 1994 will now guarantee your future." Anne studied him, the assessment in her eyes shifting from cold judgment to cautious curiosity. She remained silent, waiting for him to prove his commitment. Roland returned to his sterile fortress the next morning, but the air felt different. The silent marble walls no longer felt comforting, they felt complicit. He didn't waste a minute. He bypassed his usual schedule, ditching a crucial board meeting, and called an emergency summons for his estate manager, Davies, and his chief legal counsel. The two men entered his study, their faces tight with confusion. They were accustomed to meetings that generated millions, not meetings that dismantled policy. "We are conducting a full, immediate audit of all Packman assets currently slated for disposal, shredding, or electronic wipe," Roland announced, leaning forward over the polished teak desk. His tone left no room for debate. Davies, bewildered, asked, "Sir, that includes nearly 250,000 obsolete tablets, thousands of yards of linens, and entire furniture sets we were liquidating." "Exactly," Roland cut him off. "Effective immediately. The classification, obsolete inventory, is replaced by community resource inventory. Legal, draft a policy that requires all discarded assets, if structurally or functionally viable, to be filtered through a designated non-profit before being processed for destruction." He saw the resistance forming in their eyes, the fear of bureaucracy, the cost of re-engineering a system designed for frictionless waste. "The cost of the audit will be borne by my personal funds. The new policy is non-negotiable and takes precedence over all current disposal contracts. If there is a single roadblock, a single instance of red tape that prevents the transfer of useful supplies, I will personally dissolve the department responsible. Do you understand, gentlemen? We are re-engineering the moral output of this corporation. Roland used the full, terrifying weight of the Pac-Man name to cut through the bureaucracy he himself had spent decades refining. Within 48 hours, the inventory systems were being rewritten. The same systems that flagged Anne as a thief were now being forced to serve her vision. While his staff struggled with the technicalities, Roland focused on the core problem, securing the factory. He didn't send lawyers, he went himself. He used his name, not to buy the property for himself, but to strong-arm the current owner, a small-time, reluctant developer, into selling the building at cost to a legally established, non-profit community trust. His word, the word that shaped the city's skyline, was now used to guarantee the center's foundation. He personally oversaw the filing of the permits, making sure the building was fully compliant and secured in perpetuity for the center's use. That evening, Roland returned to the now legally secured factory. The students were still there. He stood with Anne in the small, partitioned office. "The building is secure," Roland confirmed. "The lease is cancelled. Title is vested in a community trust. It cannot be sold or evicted. Your unpaid leave is unnecessary. You are safe." Anne nodded, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. "I accept the help, Mr. Pac-Man, but on my terms." Roland waited. "I don't need your money. I need your time," she stated. "You understand finance and systems better than anyone here. The people in that room need to learn how to defend themselves against the fine print you just rewrote. You secured the physical building, now you must secure their financial future. Every Friday night, I want you to teach a workshop on basic business finance. No handouts, just the truth." Roland looked out at the faces, the tired housekeepers, the focused security guards. He was terrified of teaching, but his hesitation was instantly overcome by the profound rightness of the request. "I agree, Miss Rochas," he said, his voice husky. "I will teach them." Roland stood in the brightly lit classroom the following Friday evening. The factory was cleaner, the air warmer thanks to the repaired heating system. He was wearing his suit, but this time the suit felt like a uniform of service, not command. He looked out at the assembled students, prepared to deliver his first lesson on managing risk and leveraging credit. He saw Marcus, the security guard, giving him a hesitant, respectful nod. He saw the mothers from the cleaning crews. He saw them not as percentages on a payroll, but as people with hopes, risks, and immense dignity. Just as the bell rang for the class to begin, Anne approached him. She was carrying a small, neat package wrapped in a plain brown paper bag. She extended it to him. "This is for you, Mr. Pac-Man," she said softly. Roland opened the package. Inside was the cushion cover, soft and faded, cut from the very bed linen he had marked as missing. It was worn from use, but the stitching was perfect. It was the only item in the center that bore no trace of the Pac-Man logo. Anne's eyes twinkled with a genuine warmth he had never seen directed at him before. "Welcome to the party, Mr. Pac-Man," she said. "Glad you decided to come." Weeks turned into months, and the shock of Roland's initial discovery matured into a quiet, profound re-engineering of his life. The sterile systems that once defined him began to bend toward humanity, starting with his own routine. His Tuesday nights, once reserved for the silent ritual of checking his smart home dashboard for non-existent inventory discrepancies, were now dedicated to the factory. It was no longer a high-risk zone or a community outreach exercise. It was the Rochas Literacy Center. Roland still wore his bespoke suits, but he had learned to loosen his tie before stepping across the threshold. In the center, he was simply Roland, the finance instructor. He didn't lecture, he taught. He spoke not of maximizing profit, but of minimizing vulnerability, equipping his students, many of whom were still his own night shift employees, with the tools to understand contracts, leverage savings, and build stable credit. He often caught the eye of Marcus, the security guard, who now took notes in the neatest, clearest script Roland had ever seen. The change was most palpable in the dynamic between Roland and Anne. She was still the maid at the mansion, but the old mask was gone. Their relationship had shifted from employer-employee to co-founders, bound by mutual respect and a shared purpose. Anne was bolder now. She utilized her daytime hours at the mansion to observe his schedule and suggest strategic transfers of obsolete items. Roland would occasionally find small, neatly folded notes on his desk, not about the dinner service or the cleaning schedule, but about the center. The math tutor, needs a new whiteboard. Check the warehouse for the old conference room display model. Or, Maria needs to practice speaking for her citizenship exam. Could you spare 10 minutes to discuss the interest rates on your Gulfstream lease? This new open communication was a foundation stronger than the concrete of his towers. 6 months after the factory was legally secured, Roland stood before his entire board, his face projected onto the giant screen typically used for celebrating quarterly earnings. He was announcing the next major Pac-Man development, a $1.2 billion mixed-use tower, but the focus of his keynote was on something entirely different. A building, Roland stated, his voice ringing with conviction, is only as strong as the people who maintain it. We have spent decades prioritizing profit while simultaneously classifying the needs of our essential staff as distractions or waste. He unveiled the new company policy, the Rochas Initiative. A mandatory percentage of all Pac-Man's obsolete or disposal inventory, from surplus computers to high-end furniture deemed non-compliant, would be channeled into an independently managed endowment called the Rochas Foundation. This foundation would fund literacy, finance, and technical skills centers for low-wage workers in the city, providing the invisible people with the resources they needed to secure their own futures. It was a total reversal of his father's policy, a public correction of a 30-year corporate injustice. Roland was no longer building an empire of glass and steel. He was building a legacy of connection. Later that evening, the mansion was silent. Roland sat in his glass-walled office, the city lights glittering below. He wasn't checking his dashboard. The orange discrepancy icon had been permanently removed from his interface. Instead, he was holding a small, folded piece of notebook paper. It was a thank you note from one of his students, Maria, written after she successfully secured a small business loan to start her own cleaning cooperative. Her handwriting was neat, clear, and confident, the script of a woman who finally understood the words that once held her back. Roland smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He heard the gentle click of the staff entrance closing downstairs. Anne's shift was over. He realized she still had a life, a purpose, and responsibilities entirely outside his control. And that was okay. He was no longer following her in secret. He was simply following her purpose. Roland stood, picking up his dark jacket and a small box of newly delivered, top-of-the-line Pac-Man donated tablets, labeled clearly for the Rochas Center. He walked toward the door, not to check the locks or review his metrics, but to drive back to the factory for an unscheduled meeting with Anne about curriculum planning. He was no longer hunting a thief. He was joining the foundation. Roland and Anne's story is a powerful reminder that true wealth lies in connection. If this tale changed the way you see the people who keep the world running, please share it and subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo.